Brendan Dassey trial transcript, page 199, continuation of Fallon Questioning Newhouse. All right, tell us about the procedure you then employed for test firing. What did you do? What was the first step? Well, as I said, I simply wrote down various information about the weapon, marked the weapon for later identification. One of the examinations that's of course important to do is just to look down the barrel of the weapon after, of course, I've determined it's not loaded, and to make sure there's no obstruction in the barrel. Occasionally, the bullets don't get out of the barrels of weapons, and that's not a safe way to fire a weapon. So I did perform that examination. I essentially determined that this gun was functioning, and at that point, as I expected it to, and saw no problems with the weapon in terms of safety. I then would have test fired rounds, cartridges in the weapon, and in fact test fired 3 of them. All right, how did you test fire them? This weapon loads cartridges, or you load cartridges in it in a tube on the, just a sec, it's stuck, on the bottom of the barrel. That's this tube right here. You drop the cartridges in this slot here, and then you put the tube back in position. And then to actually fire this weapon, had it ammunition in it, I'd pull this back. This is called a bolt. Let it drop. That action pushes the cartridge into this part of the weapon called the chamber. It also cocks the weapon. That means if I pull the trigger now, it would fire, assuming I had a cartridge in there. This, by the way, for those of you that aren't familiar with weapons, is the barrel of the gun. I described to some in some detail what that is. So to fire the weapon, I pull the trigger. That click you heard was the snap of the striker or the firing pin in this weapon, and had there been a cartridge in it, it would have fired at that moment. Is there any way from just looking at it to tell what the magazine capacity is in that weapon? Or do they vary? No, the only way to do that, and I did not do that with this gun, is to actually put a number of cartridges in it, see how many it would hold. I could have looked it up in some magazine or something and determined the same thing, but it would hold, I would assume, anywhere from 10 to 15 cartridges. All right. Now, first question then, were you able to determine that that weapon fired and functioned properly? Yes, I was. All right. And it does? Nope, no, I'm sorry. That's the Newhouse, and it does. Attorney. And in order to fire it, I would imagine you would have to have some ammunition? Yes. And what ammunition did you select for your test fire? Well, one of the things that's important in my examinations is to make sure I'm firing the same kind of ammunition that was submitted, that was recovered. In other words, I examined the cartridge casings in Exhibit 128. I determined that those are CCI manufactured cartridges, 22 long rifle, and so that's what I fired in the rifle. I obtained 3 of these cartridges from a collection I have at the laboratory and fired those 3 cartridges in this weapon. All right, and what are those fired into so that you can check both the cartridge and the bullets? I have a water tank in the laboratory about 9 feet long, probably 3.5 feet deep, and a couple of feet wide. And I can fire through a tube in that essentially big box of water. I can fire my weapons into that. The water slows the bullets down. They simply drop to the bottom. The cartridge casings are, in this case, ejected from the weapon and caught in a trap that I have on the front of the water tank. All right, now with respect to your examination, were you able to determine whether those cartridge casings which were submitted to you had actually been fired from that rifle that you now hold in your hand, Exhibit 129? Yes, I was. And what opinion did you reach, sir? I was able to determine that all 11 of these cartridge casings in Exhibit 128 had been fired in this rifle. All right, and do you hold that opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty? I do. Very well. Now, did there come a time where you were asked to perform a second examination of evidence involving that very same rifle, Exhibit 129? Yes. Attorney Fallon. Let me then ask if I could have Investigator Wiegert bring Exhibits 114 and 113 to your attention. Let's begin with Exhibit 114. I believe it's item FK, Crime Lab Designation. Is that correct? That's correct. All right. Tell us about Exhibit 114, please. Well, Exhibit 114 was again a paper bag inside of which is a bullet or bullet fragment. It's a bullet that's in very bad shape. Some of it is missing. That was what I was asked to examine. I was asked to answer the same question, really. I answered with the cartridge casings, and that was whether this bullet was fired in this weapon or whether I can say it was or not. All right, tell me about the condition of that particular bullet, item FK, Exhibit 114. Item FK, the first thing I do with these items is to examine them microscopically. I want to define and determine what I can about the kind of gun that fired this based on the characteristics of the bullet that remained. For example, I can look at a bullet and determine the caliber of the bullet. In this case, I can look at this bullet and tell you that this is a 22 caliber bullet. I know because of my familiarity with guns that then it had to have been fired from a gun that's a 22 caliber gun. And that means that the bore diameter of that barrel has to be 22 inches approximately, 0.22 inches approximately. There are other class characteristics or other design features of the gun in which a bullet is fired that are transferred to that bullet. And the other one of those that I was able to look at and is present on this bullet, at least in part, were the land and groove impressions. The bullet's in very bad condition. I examined it. Some of the land and groove impressions on this had been obliterated by its contact with something hard or passage through something hard. But nonetheless, with item FK, I was able to determine that there are 8 remaining land and groove impressions on this bullet in Exhibit 114, and that they had what I would call a right-hand twist. That is, the gun from which they were fired, those grooves in that barrel were twisted clockwise when they were created. So after I've examined this bullet, I know it was fired from something manufactured in a 22 caliber, and it was fired from a gun whose barrel had 16 land and groove impressions. There were 8 remaining. There were 16 originally, and I can determine that from the 8 that remained on that bullet. What did that bullet look like? I mean, did it look like a bullet when it was submitted to you? To me, it looked like a bullet, but I'm used to looking at bullets that have struck things that have been broken up into pieces or smashed up. It may not look like a bullet to somebody who's not familiar with them. It does have the characteristics of a bullet. It's lead. That's fairly easy to determine, and it's coated with a copper coating, and that's what they do in particular with 22 caliber bullets. So I was satisfied after my microscopic examination that that's exactly what I had, was a 22 caliber bullet. All right, but if one did not have, say, the assistance of your training and experience and a microscope, to the untrained eye, what did it possibly look like? It really looks like a chunk of metal. It might not look like anything more than that to somebody who isn't used to seeing these kinds of things. All right, would the head of a roofing nail be a fair description? Well, maybe in terms of size. Again, it would look different from that. All right, what conclusions, if any, were you able to reach with respect to item FK, Exhibit 114, relative to the firearm in question here, Exhibit 129? I was limited in my conclusions to what I could tell based on the class characteristics that are there. All I can say about this item 114 is that it's a 22 caliber bullet, that it was fired from a gun manufactured with 16 lands and grooves and a right-hand twist in the barrel of the gun. I cannot be specific about what gun that was. For example, whether specifically it was fired from this particular rifle. Because of those microscopic markings that I've described as having been scratched in the surface of bullets by barrels are not present there anymore. They've been obliterated by its contact or passage through with whatever it struck. So in effect, you're saying there it just lacks sufficient individual characteristics beyond those general ones of the lands and grooves and 8 out of the 16 twists. Other than that, that's what you got? Exactly. All right, very good. Let's move on then to Exhibit 113, item FL. Did you have an opportunity to examine that particular item? I did. First of all then, for our benefit, what is item FL, Exhibit 113? Well, Exhibit 113 is a second bullet. Again, I went through the same examination process. In this case, again, I'm able to determine that it's a 22 caliber bullet. In this case, I have 11 of the original 16 land and groove impressions that were transferred to this bullet when it was fired from the gun from which it was fired. I also didn't mention on the other bullet, but I also weighed the bullet, which can be helpful in determining the caliber and so on. And additionally, on this bullet on Exhibit 113, I do have the microscopic detail, the stria and scratches on the surface of the bullet that I can relate back to a particular weapon. I can compare it to test fires from a particular weapon. All right, and as such, were you able to make any determination as to whether item FL, that's the crime lab designation, and Exhibit 113 was fired from Exhibit 129, the Marlin Glenfield 60 .22 caliber rifle? Yes, I was. And what conclusion did you reach, sir? I was able to determine that this bullet in Exhibit 113 was fired from this particular Marlin rifle. All right. And do you hold that opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty? I do. And how is that your, well, let's follow that up with, is it to the exclusion of any other rifle that bullet was fired from? It is. Why is that? When I examined the test fires from this rifle, Exhibit 129, when I looked at those bullets under the microscope, I found that I was seeing patterns of scratches or stria reproducing on each of the test fires. There's always differences, not all there on every bullet test fired from that rifle, but I was able to determine that I could expect to see certain patterns of these markings. More importantly, when I put Exhibit 113 under the microscope and compared it directly to my test fires, I was able to demonstrate that I had the same patterns on the test fires that I had on this bullet in Exhibit 113. And in fact, it was enough markings that I was able to determine that I had more agreement in these kinds of stria and these patterns of stria than I ever would expect to see from two bullets that were not fired from the same gun. We have to be able to satisfy that kind of correlation that we expect to see in bullets not fired from guns, same gun. The fact of the matter was, in this case, the patterns, the amount of agreement and correlation that I see and saw on this bullet when I compared it to test fires was enough for me to be able to conclude that it had been fired from this Marlin rifle and could have been fired in none other. All right, I'm having Investigator Wiegert show you Exhibits 134, 135. Do you recognize them? I do. And what are Exhibit 134 and 135? Well, Exhibit 134 is a report that I wrote describing the evidence I looked at and the findings or conclusions to which I came. This report is dated February 21 of 2006, and in particular it describes the examination and comparison of the cartridge casings that I looked at and related to or determined were fired in that rifle in Exhibit 129. The other report, Exhibit 135, is dated May 10 of 2006. This is the description of the bullets that I looked at in Exhibits 113 and 114 and describes my findings with regard to whether they were or were not fired from the rifle in 129. All right, and are those the official reports that you filed in this particular case? Yes, they are. Attorney Fallon, Your Honor, subject to the receipt of those last two exhibits, 134 and 135, I would tender the witness for cross-examination. The court. All right. Cross-counsel? Cross-examination by Attorney Edelstein. Good afternoon, Mr. Newhouse. You've been at it for a good while, haven't you? A little while. Okay, I'm not going to take issue with your qualifications. I think it's pretty obvious that you've had plenty of experience in the training. I do want to ask you a little bit about the FBI program. I believe you said you spent about a week out there? That's true, yes. Did you spend any time in connection with your visit to the firearm and toolmark section of the FBI lab with the metallurgy section? No, I do not. Do you know they have a metallurgy section? Yes. Does Wisconsin have a metallurgy section? No. All right. Well, let me ask you this. Given the fact that you received the empty cartridges and you were able to identify the manufacturer as CCI, did you make any attempt beyond the identification of the manufacturer to determine which specific, if you will, of CCI .22 caliber cartridge turned into or was the originating source of your FK and FL? No, there was no other association that I attempted to make between the cartridge casings and the bullets. CCI, just like a lot of manufacturers, they make a multitude of .22 caliber bullets, right? They do. Okay, they vary by weight, correct? Yes. They vary by size, and by that I mean long, short, correct? Essentially by weight, and by length, yes. Well, but that's related to the relative power, if you will, of any given cartridge because of the amount of powder? Yes. Okay. What I'm getting at, Mr. Newhouse, just to get down to the point here, the test firings that you made in order to get a clean bullet to be able to do the microscopic examination, the CCI bullets that you took from your stock, you cannot tell us that they are, in fact, the same CCI type which resulted in what you've labeled FL and FK. Is that a fair statement?